Let me now just very briefly introduce our two speakers. The plenary lecture will be given by Richard Falk, and a reply will be given by Upendra Baxi. It's no exaggeration to say that both of these figures are two of the most eminent lawyers in the world, and they are particularly esteemed for their contribution to international and constitutional law. Richard Falk is also, was also a professor of political science as well as international law at Princeton for 40 years. Upendra Baxi is also a social and political theorist who happened to be the president of two universities in India, as well as a professor of law in those universities, in the University of Warwick. Both of them are activists. You have bios for each of them, but both of them have been critically engaged in the public issues of their own societies and the world, in both cases for many years longer than they probably want to recall, but it's been an ongoing thing. And each of them may address some of these critical commitments in their remarks. Upendra, for example, has litigated tirelessly for approximately 27 years on behalf of the victims of the Bhopal disaster, which poisoned and killed when noxious gas was released by a plant of Union Carbide, which killed many people and blighted the lives of many others. And it's an interesting struggle concerning the nature of impunity and economic power. So we have two very significant figures to open this this conference. I have learned a great deal from them in my academic life, and I expect to learn a great deal more in the course of the next hour or so. So I'd like to first of all call on Richard Falk to give our plenary talk. Welcome, Richard, and thanks for coming here.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that gentle introduction. And let me congratulate you and your collaborators for putting together such a challenging agenda and such a outstanding cast of participants. And it's both privilege and somewhat intimidating to be part of this this event. Both Stephen Gill and Upendra Baxi are not only old friends, but are seminal thinkers who've influenced me a great deal over a long period of time. And I think that the subject matter that we're addressing today is at the very center of what we can expect and hope for about the future. My own sense of how to think about the future of global governance is inspired by an assertion from an essay of Ralph Waldo Emerson, 19th century poet and philosopher. And he wrote, "The health of the eye seems to demand a horizon. We are never tired so long as we can see far enough." And perhaps the simplest way of expressing my critical thesis from this perspective of Emerson is to say that the world badly needs a geopolitical ophthalmologist because we're not currently able to see the reality that confronts us in the present and in the future. In my view, our academic discipline lacks an appropriate horizon for considering the future of global governance. Most inquiry is entrapped in what I would call horizons of feasibility that anticipate the future as essentially a continuation of the past, as a embodiment of incremental thinking. And this excludes the unexpected as well as the necessary and desirable. But as any superficial account of recent world history would confirm, the important shifts in the course of the last several decades, both for better and worse, were not anticipated by this kind of thinking. The end of the Cold War, the peaceful transformation of racist South Africa, the 9/11 attacks, the 2008 financial meltdown, and now the unfolding of the Arab Spring all came as radical surprises to the academic community and to the policy domain. And however many billions were spent on intelligence activities that supposedly provide the best available information, the only explanations that were given of these transformative events were retrospective ones. We can explain the past from this horizon of feasibility, but we're unable to really understand the present or the future. A prominent book, The Black Swan, convincingly argues the reality of human experience is essentially a narrative of the unexpected and implausible. That's, I think, a very important kind of insight to try to assimilate. Because the horizon of the feasible dominates the thinking not only of the academic community, but especially of those that are charged with the shaping of foreign policy. It projects its approach as political realism and purports to understand the shaping of history mainly through the prism of hard power. But its blind spots are so central to its orientation at this time of history in the 21st century that it should probably be more aptly described in the phrase used by a well-known sociologist, C. Wright Mills, what he called crackpot realism a long time ago. It is based on a reality that is incapable of addressing the future and unwilling, in a sense, to do so, and encodes within its explanatory account of reality the unjust features of the present world order, including exaggerated reliance on the agency of hard power diplomacy. That exaggerated reliance has expressed itself recently in the effort to address the threat of terrorism by military interventions in countries like Afghanistan and to some extent Iraq, by threats directed at Iran, and by the military intervention now taking place in Libya. These all presuppose the agency of hard power as the dominating force in the making and sustaining of global governance. Extending its scope to include law and legitimacy is treated from this realist perspective as either essentially irrelevant or as moralizing propaganda. Henry Kissinger is probably the most influential exponent of this way of seeing the world and what shapes it. And his contempt for law and legitimacy, except when it promotes power objectives, is ill-disguised. And in his memoirs, he acknowledges his displeasure and impatience with whenever his aides talk to him about the moral or legal dimensions of policy. And so one needs to understand, I believe, in conceptualizing global governance, that the horizon of feasibility is organically linked to horizons of hierarchy. Those structures, practices, and norms designed to perpetuate the control of the poor and the weak by the rich and the dominant. The political leadership associated with neoliberal globalization, who might be called the Lords of Davos, have done just that, widening disparities of wealth and income within and between countries while ignoring the ticking bombs of unsustainability. And those ticking bombs include, as Stephen has already reminded us, of global warming and climate change, the onset of peak oil and water scarcity. These dimensions of unsustainable world order are, in a sense, not addressed because of this orientation toward reality that's anachronistic even from the perspective of those who benefit from the present arrangements. From the perspectives of law and legitimacy, to serve humanity rather than the current global imperium, the horizons of hierarchy must be replaced in our thinking and politics by what I call horizons of necessity. That is, what must be done to ensure our future viability as a species inhabiting the planet and safeguarding the opportunities of future generations, but also by horizons of desire, what I suppose is meant in the Gramscian phrase, optimism of the will. What we should, as I understand horizons of desire, it's what we should do to respect the dignity of the human person, the essential embodiment of a human rights outlook, and the sacredness of life on the planet. In other words, a combination of humanistic and ecological outlook as informing horizons of desire. This means building a role for law and legitimacy that embodies the logic of equality and reciprocity and displaces the present logic of world order, which is premised essentially on inequality and domination. If one tries to examine more concretely this present logic of inequality and domination, it can be easily illustrated in major areas of global public policy. For instance, the approach to nuclear weapons through the regime of non-proliferation, which is administered geopolitically in such a way as to create the impression that the danger of nuclear weapons comes from the countries that don't possess these weapons rather than from the ones that do. It's an extraordinary mind game that the nuclear weapons states, particularly the United States, have played with the rest of the world for several decades, of course. And there's a foundational treaty that has established this regime, supposedly on the basis of mutuality, because the nuclear weapons states agree to get rid of their weapons by good faith nuclear disarmament negotiations in exchange for the non-nuclear states foregoing their nuclear weapons option. But what has happened in practice for the more than 50 years now that this agreement has been in force is that the non-nuclear weapon states are selectively subject to military attack if they violate this regime. The most prominent example was the war against Iraq, based on a kind of false premise, but the premise was that if Iraq was acquiring nuclear weapons, it should be fair game for military aggression, where some countries can slip under the regime's legal coverage, such as Israel, and never have to account for their nuclear possession of nuclear weapons. So not only is the treaty in practice, as distinct from textually, unequal, because the provisions applicable to the non-nuclear states are implemented geopolitically, they are enforced, whereas the obligations to engage in good faith disarmament are completely ignored. And even in the face of a World Court admonition to the nuclear weapons states that they had an obligation to respect that part of the non-proliferation treaty, it was completely dismissed without any adverse consequences. So it illustrates this double-edged nature of international law in this kind of world order, global governance framework. Namely, that the text says one thing, and the geopolitical regime overrides that text in a very selective and discriminatory manner. And that's a clear example. Another, I think, telling example is connected with international criminal accountability of political leaders with respect to the laws of war and the obligation to refrain from crimes against humanity. This was initiated as a practical matter after World War II, when German and Japanese leaders were held criminally accountable, and it was, I think, appropriately criticized at the time as victor's justice, even though those that were accused were given fair trials and did do reprehensible things on behalf of their particular political communities. But just as if you take the logic of equality seriously, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was certainly one of the legal atrocities committed by the victorious powers and yet exempted from scrutiny. In his final statement to the court at Nuremberg, the American prosecutor, Justice Jackson, made what I've called the Nuremberg Promise, which was that those that sat in judgment of the German and indirectly the Japanese leaders would in the future be subject to those same principles, that same framework, or otherwise this trial would lack legitimacy. This argument has been made even more, I think, cogently and fully by the German philosopher Karl Jaspers in his book, The Question of German Guilt, where he, I think, very persuasively sets forth the understanding that Germans were truly responsible for engaging in criminal conduct, and the global rule of law really depends on holding those who act for the state accountable. But if this accountability is not based on a logic of equality, then it lacks legitimacy as a form of acceptable law, because the essence of law is to treat equals equally. And when equals are treated unequally, we have no problem thinking about leaders like Saddam Hussein or Slobodan Milosevic as being subject to this framework of international criminal accountability. But when it comes to Tony Blair or George W. Bush, we are central organs of orthodoxy won't even address the question. It's kept out of our collective consciousness that we are dealing with these issues of fundamental justice on the basis of a logic of hierarchy and discrimination. I would just briefly give a third area where I think this is important, and that's the present, is illustrated by the present UN-backed NATO intervention in Libya, which supposedly was a no-fly zone designed to protect people, particularly in Benghazi, and was quickly transformed into an effort to change the outcome of an internal civil war, which is not only an abandonment of the rule of law by a mission that is quite contradictory to what was authorized, but it also is represents a dysfunctional reliance on hard power solutions to political conflicts. Over and over again, the reliance on hard power since the end of World War II has proved a failure, which is one of the encouraging underlying historical realities that is completely suppressed and unacknowledged by political realism as an operative code shaping foreign policy. So what I'm really trying to argue is that we need, for a healthy horizoning of the future of global governance, a shift in emphasis from what I would call scientific knowledge, that is reliant on empirical observation, data, history that is useful for understanding the past, a shift from this kind of scientific knowledge to what I would call normative knowledge, the resources of the political, moral, cultural, and spiritual imagination, which historically understood and again alluded to in Stephen's remark about Orientalism. It's essential that this kind of normative knowledge assumes a de-Westernized outlook and orientation. And one of the developmental realities that is changing the way in which world order is unfolding is certainly the rise of the non-West and the changing geopolitical landscape that is transforming the sense of how conflict and policy should be addressed and resolved.